through all of our programs that we've been having. So tonight is no different. So tonight we're going to have a discussion about trauma and how it impacts the Black community. So I would like you to think about these three things during our conversation. One, at any time the conversation becomes too much, too heavy, I would like for you to take care of yourself. Be very intentional about that. And I'm going to give you three things I would like you to do to take care of yourself. One, please make sure you have water available to you. That's very important. Because when the body is very stressed, and sometimes when trauma is flowing through the body gets very dehydrated. So you want to make sure that you have water on hand throughout our discussion today so that you can hydrate the body. The second thing is you want to make sure that you kind of regulate your breathing, because there are times when your body will respond to something that is said, and sometimes your breathing can become unregulated. So to do that, you just want to engage in some breathing exercises and make sure that you exhale longer than you inhale. And lastly, I want you to think about what you're going to do after this conversation tonight to take care of yourself. Right? Have a plan. Whether you're going to watch something funny on TV, spend time with your children, spend time with your pet, friends, call a friend, but definitely have something to do after this conversation to kind of help you decompress. So I'm going to turn it over to my soror footman, who will continue to moderate our discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, Soror President Hughes. Before we jump into our conversation this evening, we just want to do some framing around the purpose of our Divine Healing series, particularly as this is our first installment of this great series. Trauma and injustice continue to impact the Black community, and with racial unrest and the pandemic spotlighting the need for change. It is our hope that this series will help to discuss and unpack the effect of trauma in our communities, social activism, and the healing of ourselves, families, and communities. This particular session, which is entitled Trauma Normalized, is in order to fully understand the need for healing, we must first understand what needs to be healed. This session will dive into what trauma is, how it has become normalized in our communities, and its impact on the world. We will incorporate a healing element in each of our series sessions. And so throughout the series, we will explore ways that we can practice self, family, and community healing through self-awareness and other tools. This evening specifically, we will find out how we can heal through breathing. So without further ado, we will begin with the introduction of our panelists. And so we have Mr. Phillip Roundtree, Miss Natalie Dallard, and Dr. Natasha Mack. And so as you each start to share respond to your first questions, please also take the time to share a little bit about the work that you all do and what brings you to this conversation this evening. So the first question is for Natalie. When we really think about what is trauma, big T and little t, and then once Natalie responds, we can then have the other panelists also chime in as well.
So good evening, and thank you to Chester Alumnae for having me this evening. Again, my name is Natalie Dallard. I am actually the Child Trauma Operations Specialist for the Philadelphia Alliance for Child Trauma Services. So what PACS is a citywide initiative under the Department of Behavioral Health and Intellectual Disability to address the pervasive problem of trauma within Philadelphia's Medicaid population, and specifically the children. So my job is essentially to work on the city's response to child trauma in Philadelphia. And so when we think about trauma, if you ask each one of us, I'm sure we'll each give you a different answer, because trauma is actually very subjective. But from a professional standpoint, they'll tell you that it's a response to a frightening or overwhelming event. And usually it's an event that makes you feel like you lost control. You may feel that your life is in danger. You may feel helpless, right? And this can be any number of things, and each person can experience the same event a different way. And so when you talk about big T traumas and little t traumas, big T traumas would be things like experiencing maybe an earthquake, or being the victim of sexual assault, or being the victim of a violent crime, right? That's what we traditionally think of. And then we think of little t traumas as things like maybe moving to a new area and leaving all of your friends behind, or losing a job. So it's something that it can be traumatic to you, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you were in fear of your life at the time. But I think that, you know, when we think about Black folks, right, we're always at a baseline of trauma. So the difference is, I think of trauma as this constant state of feeling unsafe and not in control of your surroundings. And so, you know, I think it's really important, and I'm really happy that we're having this conversation, just because of the fact that, you know, even as a professional, multi-degreed Black woman, there's always a basic level of unsafeness that I feel, and that I'm sure that many of individuals in this on the panel and in the community feel as well. So I'm going to open it up and let other folks kind of piggyback or add to my response.
Thank you for that. Dr. Natasha Mack, did you want to respond?
Y'all gonna have to bear with me with the muting and unmuting. I'm horrible. I'll be talking for 30 minutes muted. So just give me a signal or something. So I think Natalie pretty much covered it. It's just important to know that every event that's experienced as trauma isn't necessarily ongoing. It can be just a single event, some one thing that happened that caused the trauma, and then it can be something that is ongoing, such as racism in America. And things can be traumatic, whether they're subtle or whether they're direct. They can have long-term impacts or short-term impacts. So it really is very different depending on the person who's experiencing.
Thank you for that. Phil, did you have anything that you wanted to add before we moved on to our next question?
No, I think they covered it.
Thank you for that. So the next question, and I believe, Natalie, you touched a little bit on this already. What are some of the common ways people in the Black community are affected by trauma? Phil, we'll start with you.
I think, well, so first of all, we can start at an epigenetic basis, right? So we can talk about historical trauma and how that's been implanted on our genes. And so we're kind of already born with the traumas experienced by previous generations, right? So we know that the things that your ancestors and forefathers have experienced impact your genes and your genetic makeup. So you may have some behavioral traits, or maybe prone to mental health issues that you don't know where it came from, right? Because you had a pretty great upbringing, you know, you had your family, money, all the things that we think of that would make people happy, and yet you may be experiencing some symptoms that are related to something that's way down the family line that you're not even aware of. And then I think the other part that I touched on is this idea of safety, right? And how that plays out in your interpersonal relationships, how that looks in the way you relate to other people, how that looks at work. Black people, we, you know, are just constantly in a heightened state of awareness, right? We're constantly in that trauma stress response, because this world has demonstrated to us that it's not safe for us here.
Thank you for that. Phil, did you want to respond?
I'm trying to learn how to unmute myself. Not like I haven't been on Zoom like the last year like everybody else, right? And shout out to, is that Dow Baby? I don't want to, we're going to keep it. Yeah, had to hit it with, salute to you. What's happening? No, you know, she definitely touched on the different types of trauma. There's so many, you know, when we talk about Black folk, we talk about, especially our impoverished Black folk, we're talking about those types of complex trauma, right? We're talking about, I used to work for for unfortunately, the Department of Human Services in Philadelphia, where 95% of the people that we quote unquote investigate are black and brown people, right? And so we're talking about quality of life issues, something that just can't be remedied within an hour, right? We're talking about housing. We're talking about all those those things that poverty influences, right? We're talking about bullying. Bullying is traumatic. Something we've seen an uptick in, since the advent of social media, right? Because who knows what it feels like to have a video of you getting punched in your face circulating around the world, and how that impacts you. And again, medical traumas, physical traumas. There's honestly, everything could be traumatic depending upon the individual, right? Because it's unique to that individual. But what impacts black folk that I speak a lot about is the historical trauma that was talked about previously. We talk about the impact of enslavement. We talk about Jim Crow, civil rights movement. We're talking about seeing the traumatic experience, when white folk wanted to do their thing a couple weeks ago, right? I stayed out their business. I let them do them, but it's still traumatic in a sense, because you're seeing so many black folks saying, "Well, damn, if that was me, I would have got killed," right? And so that's traumatic, and that's a response to trauma, right? So yeah, so again, we could sit here all day and have a conversation on the various types.
Absolutely. Dr. Mack, did you want to add anything to that?
I think it was pretty much covered. I think it's important to mention the fact that we're experiencing a pandemic right now. So we have the racism, the subtle racism, the direct and overt racism, which has long-term impacts on the mental and behavioral health of our communities. But then we have COVID-19. We have the racial injustice protests that may have brought on new trauma on top of the years of systematic racism and discrimination and microaggressions that have forced us being Black communities, to live in this constant state of hypervigilance, high alert, and causing lots and lots of traumatic stress.
Absolutely. And as you said, there is so many different public health epidemics that we are navigating, whether it's COVID, whether it is racism, whether it's gun violence, and all stemming from systemic racism. And unfortunately, communities of color, particularly Black communities, are disproportionately impacted by all of those, and they're all conflating currently. So thank you for definitely pointing that out. And I think that will definitely come up throughout the rest of our conversation. And so the next question that we really want to dive into is, does someone want to really talk about the different types of trauma that we currently do see and that we as a community may experience individually and collectively? I think we've started to hit on it a little bit with the big T and little t, but is there different types of trauma that we want to parse out so folks can have some language around that? And I'll open that up to anyone that may want to respond. Phil, did you want to say something?
You just gonna call my name, huh?
Well, it looked like you were.
No, I was saying who gonna say something, because I have a propensity to talk a lot. No, I think the good doc hit on it. This racism and systemic racism, and just how that is impacting how Black folk are showing up, especially on January 27th, 2021, right? We look at and I don't want to get into the other areas of other questions, and so, but I'll definitely talk about racism, where for me, I'm really just now walking in my Blackness. It took a long time, right? And when we talk about racism, we talk about all the ways that white supremacy and patriarchy and capitalism impact us. It impacts how we show up in our relationships, which I know we're going to talk about later. It impacts how we see one another. I probably about a few years ago now, I was being honored for something, as well as a bunch of other brothers down in Miami by Black Enterprise, and this just goes to show how deep that racism is, and the impact that it has. So I was cool, like, all right, I'm about to go get on the plane. Got on the plane, sat next to this brother Frank Brady from New Haven, Connecticut. He just happened to be going to the same place, right? And so, especially up north, we don't smile at one another when we, as far as black men, because either if you smile at me, you're either a homosexual, right, or I think you're plotting on me some way somehow. And so he's sitting there, sitting right next to me, and trying to spark up conversation, and it was uncomfortable, right, because how I've been conditioned to view another black man. And so and this was like a day after I quit my job and became a full-time entrepreneur. So I don't care what Drake said, like, I needed new friends, you know what I mean, because I needed a paycheck. And so I sat there and think, like, why aren't I engaging with this brother, right? He's jovial. He has a great spirit, and so I interacted with him. And then I got down there, and you got a couple hundred brothers all smiling and engaging with one another. And I had to take a step back and think, like, this is a direct result, right, of enslavement and white supremacy and the constant propaganda of fear that has been pushed within our community, right? And so that impacts, again, how we show up.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And thank you for sharing your own personal journey and how you have continued to develop in that way. Is there anything else that you would like to share, Dr. May?
I think that when you ask about types of trauma, you can put trauma in a couple of buckets. So what I mean by that is that there's an acute trauma, which is really the result of a single stressful, dangerous event. So maybe there was a car accident, that would be an acute trauma. And then you have like chronic trauma that results from repeated, prolonged exposure to high stress events like child abuse, like bullying, like domestic violence. Then there's complex trauma, and that results from exposure to multiple traumatic events over and over a period of time, which will bring us to our like racism, systematic racism, microaggressions, and things of that nature that we all experience on a daily basis. So sometimes it's helpful to be able to think about trauma in those different buckets to try to define it better. It's so broad. There's so much that sometimes you have to try to break it down in pieces.
Absolutely. Thank you for explaining that. Natalie, anything else that you would like to add before we move to the next question?
No, I actually think everybody that they covered those.
Okay. Absolutely. Thank you. So Natalie, I guess I'll kick the next question over to you. How has trauma been normalized within our community and society as a whole?
Well, I think that, so this is part of like us, the internalized depression, right? We have adopted a very Eurocentric view of healing and community, meaning, you hear about in America, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, rugged individualism, have a stiff upper lip, just keep working and getting it done, right? We normalize going to work when we're sick. We normalize just kind of, someone could pass away and you just come to work. Look, January 6th, I'm sitting in meetings watching these fools, storm the Capitol. And I'm like, you really expect me to hold it together right now? How many times as Black people have we watched individuals be murdered by police and had to go to work the next day? And that's part of us. That's part of that internalized oppression. That's part of white supremacy. So I actually think, can you repeat the question? I think I started getting excited and then forgot what I was talking about.
Oh, no. We were just saying, how has trauma been normalized in our community and society as a whole?
So I think so all of that, we absorb all of this, right? We've normalized watching murders. We all have seen videos and they replay them on the 24-hour news reel. And so that's trauma. And we're all absorbing that energy every day. And now it just becomes like, oh yeah, another Black man dead in the street, another Black woman, incarcerated, taken away from her children. We have normalized disenfranchising communities, right? So the thing that I love about Black culture and Black people, we're a collectivist culture, and we believe in working together for the betterment of all and healing each other. But we've kind of learned over the years to kind of turn a blind eye sometimes, right? So sometimes it's, look, that's what's going on in their house. I'm not saying anything. You can hear your neighbor getting beat. We've all heard stories where domestic violence going on within the neighborhood. Everyone knew what was going on. Everybody kind of turned a blind eye, like, that's not my business, as opposed to being unafraid to step in and intervene, even if it's just slipping someone a note, like, listen, when you're ready to go, I'm here for you. So I think that we have normalized accepting all of these images. We have, as Keela put in the comments, we're experiencing collective trauma, right? And we're not talking about it. We're not dealing with it. We're learning to compartmentalize, to ignore, to glorify, right? So if we think about the things we consume, the movies we consume, the images, and listen, I love hip hop, but hip hop glorifies violence, right? And we're just absorbing all of that energy and not realizing it. And we often, with children, overlook the things that they see and are exposed to. We kind of think, hey, they're too young to understand. Little kids can reenact traumatic events and tell you about traumatic events, and they remember things, and the behavior shows up in the classroom. And these are all things we kind of normalize, sweeping that under the rug, not talking about it. So I think, as a whole, this is a country full of trauma. We were founded on trauma, right? What we did to the Native American, that one I would say what we didn't do anything. What they did to the Native Americans, that was the start. That's what this country is built on.
Thank you for that historical framing and then how it translates to contemporary issues and events. Dr. Mack, were you going to chime in?
So I was going to say that I find that many of us don't even know how to identify an event as traumatic. And it's not because we don't feel the aftermath of the experience, of the negative experience. I would actually argue that it's more likely because we have learned to normalize our trauma and pain in many ways, and aren't aware that the experiences that we had are directly connected to our anxieties or our stresses or our depression. So for instance, we've kind of normalized racism as part of the Black experience. This is a thing we gotta go through as Black people. So we teach our boys how to respond when they're pulled over by the police. We teach our children, when you go out, somebody might call. I remember the very first time I was called a nigger by a white person. So I was born and raised in Brooklyn, in Brownsville Projects. But when I went to high school, I went outside of my neighborhood for the very first time to go to high school, and had that experience there where a young white girl called me, and I was floored by that. So I took that home to my parents, like, yo, this girl called me a nigger. What do I do with this? And got the conversation about how that's going to happen. It's part of our experience. Here's how you respond to it, which I then taught to my children, which they'll teach them. So it's just our thing. It shouldn't be traumatic. It's our Black experience. So we can't necessarily always tease out that an event is traumatic because we've made it part of our experience. It's even true in our homes with domestic violence and child abuse. Don't let what goes on in my house stays in my house. Don't you let nothing that happens in here go ahead. So we don't know to reach for help. We don't know when to actually take something outside of our home because we have normalized it as part of our family experience. So we have learned to cope by incorporating things into our experience and then telling ourselves that it's the thing we have to deal with. So we'll learn to do that. We adapt. That is how humans do. And we, as African-American people, as Black folks, we are the best at adapting. So we have learned to do that. And so that's how we normalize it.
Thank you for that. That is definitely very true. And thank you for providing that framing. Phil, is there anything that you wanted to add?
No, I think they both did an outstanding job in covering. I'll just add that, when the good doc was talking, it's survival, right? It's survival. What are the consequences if she did respond to the N word, right? They're going to be drastic for her. So a lot of times we we ingest those experiences and keep them, not recognizing that we do need to try to do our best, the best that we can, to rid ourselves of all that comes with that. I think when we talk about normalizing trauma, I don't think we need to look any further than the shade room, where 21.9 million people follow that account. Right? Some people might be on here. I ain't shaming nobody because that's not what I do, even though that's what I'm doing right now. But we think about it like it's a lot of black pain that they're profiting over, a lot of dysfunction within relationships, a lot of racist acts and videos that they post up. Nothing that truly, I mean, every now and then they'll definitely post something to try and edify the black community, right? But if we think about what it's founded on, because why? Trauma and pain is profitable. And so that's where we are as a society, and especially as a community.
Thank you for that. And thank you for putting it in that definitely a contemporary context, and for sharing how sites like that definitely can help normalize the experiences that we feel as a community. So I'll start with Dr. Mack this time. Can you share what the differences between trauma and PTSD is? Oh, you have to unmute. You did tell us.
I did. I warned you. It does not get better. All right. So, post-traumatic stress disorder and trauma. So people actually use them interchangeably a lot, even though the two issues are related. They're very different. So trauma is the emotional response to whatever the incident was, the event was that happened, and it can occur many times. And there's more than one type of trauma. Individuals who've experienced one or more traumatic events might experience some behavioral, social, emotional issues following the event. The effects can be really severe. They can interfere with somebody's ability to live a normal life, and they can develop anxiety, depression, and they can develop post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, post-traumatic stress disorder is a mental health disorder. And it can develop in some individuals who have experienced trauma. So a person who's suffering from PTSD can re-experience the traumatic event through flashbacks, through dreams, and even just through waking thoughts. They might actively avoid places or people or thoughts that remind them of the event that happened. They might have a startle reflex, be easily startled by things, have difficulty sleeping, experience some outbursts of anger. They can experience negative thoughts about themselves, about the world, have trouble remembering what the event was, feel guilty, blame themselves for causing the event to happen. So PTSD often follows a traumatic event. However, not all traumatic events lead to the development of PTSD.
Thank you for that. That is very helpful to understand that clear distinction and how they are also similar. Is there anything that Phil or Natalie would like to add before we move on to the next question?
I just want to add that when we think about trauma in children in particular, many of the symptoms of PTSD or even PTSS, post-traumatic stress syndrome, mirror the symptoms of ADHD, right? So we have a number of children throughout the years that have been placed on ADHD medication, have been told that they have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, they have these problems concentrating. And what is really is that these kids are experiencing PTSD symptoms, and they're having trouble coping in the school environment, because the school environment, when you have a bunch of kids who have the same issues going on, they often, can interact and set each other off. Or if you have a teacher who has created an environment that doesn't allow for the safety that this child needs to thrive, then they exhibit those behaviors. So I think it's really important when you think about how things manifest in children, and then you think about things like the school to prison pipeline, right? all of these things are kind of interchangeable. They are interwoven and feed into each other.
Thank you for that. Anything that you wanted to add, Phil? I didn't want to cut you off if there was something that you were going to say.
No, I think she's opened up a can of worms with her last comment, just because we start getting into the over pathologizing and marginalizing of Black folk within mental health. When we think about psychiatry and psychology, and again how it's founded on white supremacy. Right now, as a therapist, as a a doctoral candidate or what have you, I'm sitting now reflecting on my role in perpetuating white supremacy. I worked as a behavioral specialist within these classroom settings that she referenced. That usually comes from a white teacher who has poor classroom management skills to start, and then they have unrealistic expectations of children who've experienced various types of trauma. And here I am, my role and responsibility is to tell them that, listen, it's about you, right? And not necessarily that the environment that produced you and that you find yourself in. So yeah, but don't get me started.
So since you're already off mute, we'll let you start with the next question. What is post-traumatic slave syndrome, and how does it contribute to the constant re-traumatization of within the Black community? It seemed like it aligned with where you picked up from Natalie.
Word. I'm in page like 3 of, it's the concept by, I believe it's Dr. Joy DeGruy, who coined that term, and it's the idea of the Black experience and Blackness that impacts how we have shown up throughout history, right? So it truly takes into account slavery. It takes into account Jim Crow and Reconstruction. And I mean, if she continues to revise it, we get to present day and what we've seen, with the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. It's this type of trauma that's endemic to Black folk. Black and brown folk, but brown folk are Black folk, but that's another discussion in itself too. And so when we have this discussion about it, it's really, because when we think about PTSD, it's the idea that Black, white, brown, any race or ethnicity can have PTSD. But when we talk about post-traumatic slave disorder, we're talking about everything that came from that unique experience that others can't understand, it can't resonate with them, and how it manifests itself within us. So when I talk about the stoning of the face, right, not smiling, this comes from going back to enslavement, right, where I can't smile, I can't be happy and cheerful. Why? Because that could mean the end of me. Right, and so we adopt these characteristics for what? For survival purposes. So I'm sure somebody else can expound upon it.
Yes, absolutely. Dr. Mack or Natalie, would either one of you like to respond? Okay, I will move on to the next question. So, Natalie, the next question is, what role has the media played in the trauma of the Black community? And I think we've talked a little bit on this as we talked about things like the Shade Room, and then different things we also see just on the daily news with the killing of unarmed Black people.
I mean, I think Phil touched upon it beautifully when he tied it into capitalism, right? So Black trauma and Black pain is big business. And so we are consistently the victims, re-victimized, re-traumatized by the media. Again, like I talked about before with the 24-hour news cycle, where they're constantly showing Black people being murdered. And then you also think about the way that Black people are portrayed in the media, right? If we go back to historically the types of roles we were offered. In movies, we're robbers, the movie is a slave movie, it's a gangster movie. Somebody's in the hood, we die in the first 5 minutes of the horror movies. Like our presence in entertainment, although we set the culture, we're undervalued and we're treated as objects. So in many ways, Black people are dehumanized by entertainment, media. Our bodies and our fullness is not appreciated, it's not demonstrated. And so it leads, young Black children. We're seeing a rise in suicides among our young Black children, specifically kids in the 10 to 13 age range. And a lot of it is like these images that they're consuming online about their value, and then the things that they're experiencing in their communities. But I think places like the Shade Room, and I saw Phil unmute, so I'm gonna let him jump in. But I feel like we're constantly taught that we're less than. We're constantly taught that we don't matter. Our hair is cool, but not when we wear it, right? Our hairstyles are only cool when other people wear it. If something bad happens to us, we always talk about this, right? If a Black child goes missing, if they make it to the news, everybody's like, that's really nice, they put it on the news. Meanwhile, if a white child goes missing, we're going to hear about this every day until, we still hearing about John Benet Ramsey. Not to trivialize a child's life, but there's a lot of things that it just contributes to that feeling of being less than, which is a trauma in and of itself.
Thank you for that. Well, were you going to say anything, or I was just going to send it over to Dr. Mack?
Oh no, I was actually muting myself because I saw I wasn't unmuted.
Oh, okay, thank you. Dr. Mack, did you want to add to that?
So there's also the desensitization that media causes. So I have never witnessed so many murders of Black men as I have in the past few years. I mean, it is put on display on the news, and then it'll get to social media and people will start passing it back and forth. Like, did you see the video of the latest Black man that was killed? Here you go. And it's just, people don't even stop a moment to think you are witnessing a murder. You are witnessing a man being murdered, and you are traumatizing yourself and then sending it on to further traumatize people in your community by witnessing that. So there's a desensitization that is happening, not just with that, in other ways too, with the media.
Thank you for that. And thank you for sharing that, because I think a lot of times people are not considering the trauma that they are then imparting onto someone else just by sharing that type of clip, and asking them even if they want to share it or even if they feel comfortable talking about it, because it does happen so frequently. Phil, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was gonna come in
Okay.
now.
Okay.
I just a few things, right? Like when we have this conversation about individuals being killed, it always, murdered by the state. It always goes to the cliche unarmed Black man, right? And we think about how we've been conditioned for that to be the catchphrase for when this happens, when it happens to Black women, when it happens to trans persons, right? We automatically go to unarmed Black man killed. And then even the idea of unarmed, right? We're saying unarmed, but even if the person is armed, they're still not supposed to get killed, right? And so we've normalized that idea and this just shows you how conditioning works, right? Because we say unarmed and saying they just killed a Black person, right? Because if they are armed, that might have, subconsciously be more justifiable. And so we just have to be mindful of just the type of programming that's taking place. I was one who was against the idea of sharing videos, right? Just because I recognize that it is trauma. I came around to the importance of it, right? Because it's the idea of, we've seen how these has sparked people. Gil Scott Heron talks about, the revolution will not be televised. And what does that mean? It's when that light switches for you, when you can never go back to the same you because you're enlightened at this point. And so me sharing a video to another black person, unfortunately, some people are visual learners, right? And they need to actually see in order for that whatever type of revolution that's going to take place. Like, I'm thankful for COVID. It might seem wild, right? But as we see now, Patrick Warren Sr., a black man who was having a mental health episode in Killeen, Texas, or I believe it was January 9th, was murdered by the police, right? And he trended for maybe about 3 or 4 hours, and then it was gone. But because COVID had us all sitting in place, right, we had nothing else to do. Everything was closed. And so with George Floyd taking place, we were in Ahmaud Arbery, we knew that came out months later, and Breonna Taylor came out, months after the incident took place. But the fact that this was all taking place in that instance and it was circulated, did we really start to see a shift? And I don't even care about what white folk do, what type of shift they do, but I saw a shift within the community, right, where it wasn't just a 1 day protest. We're still seeing people still putting forth that effort, but unfortunately for some people it was, that switch was clicked back down, right? So I think it's important, even though I won't view them, I think they are important to be shared.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate that insight. So this question that I'm going to ask next, I'm going to ask Natalie and Dr. Mack to respond. And this is just shifting a little bit specifically to those that have experienced sexual abuse or assault, and how do they carry their trauma? Natalie, do you want to start? Or
Doesn't matter. I was going to ask.
We just were both trying to unmute.
Right. So sexual trauma can look a lot of different ways, and I think I'm like Natasha, just stay unmuted so we can tag team this one. But it can look a lot of different ways. So I like to think about. So first of all, I like to think about in children, right? So there's lots of different behaviors that children who have experienced sexual victimization can exhibit. Some children can become hypersexual, where they, so these are, I think about those girls and boys that we like to label as fast. And no one, not often do people ask the question of where these behaviors generated from. Kids, are not just born, with some behaviors where they're super fast. Now, kids do exhibit sexual behaviors at young ages, but they can be hypersexual. You can have kids who are irritable and angry, who use either the fight, flight, or flee response. So kids who run away a lot. You can have kids who like to fight. And then you have some kids who maybe as a result of their sexual victimization dissociate. And they are like the kids who you kind of see off in the clouds, or they're very withdrawn. And these are not just, I'm talking about children and specifically, but adults can also demonstrate these behaviors, because what we know is that oftentimes early childhood trauma that follows people through the lifespan if they don't resolve it and deal with it. So some of those same behaviors can carry on. It can look like problems in relationships. It can be sexual dysfunction. It can be, again, promiscuity, or like being highly sexually active, but with, sometimes risky, sometimes not. Sexual behavior can also look like individuals who have gained a lot of weight. I don't know if many of you watch My 600 Pound Life. And so often folks on that show, when they start telling their stories, there's a history of sexual abuse in their stories. Some individuals who've experienced sexual assault may exhibit anxiety, depression. They may develop post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. Could be a lot of different things. I don't know if Natasha, you want to fill in some other things that I might have missed.
So you pretty much got it. There's a variety of sexual concerns after a sexual assault. So some survivors may want no sexual contact whatsoever. Others may want to use sex as a coping mechanism. which some people will interpret as promiscuity when it's really an attempt to regain power and control. Some people may experience some confusion around separating sex from the sexual abuse. Um, Particular sex acts may provoke flashbacks and so be difficult for the survivor to engage in. It can look like eating disorders, substance abuse, isolation and extreme isolation, shame. I could go on. And that's not true for everyone. Also, it looks different for different people. There are some things that are quite common. And then there are some things that will be specific to a specific person. So there are some of these things that we're talking about that might manifest themselves, and it has nothing to do with the sexual assault. So I don't want Natalie and I to kind of rattle off these things and you start thinking, oh my gosh, that's what's happening with my cousin. That's not necessarily the case. I just want to put that out there.
Thank
Yeah.
you. No, go ahead.
I agree. I definitely agree that with anyone, you know, folks are incredibly resilient and they display different levels of resilience and they're impacted in different ways. So you may be sitting next to survivors every day and not realize that because they have coped. And that may be with or without professional help. Some people just, you know, it just impacts them in different ways.
Thank you for that. And something that you both touched on is relationships and how childhood trauma or trauma in different parts of the lifespan can impact how people show up in relationships. Could you all briefly respond to what does trauma look like potentially in relationships, if
I'm
not
sorry.
dealt with?
Before we go, can I speak to that
Yeah.
that last question? Because I see this happen. I don't think it's intentionally, right? You know, just for, and I know, you know, that called Dow baby. I'm sorry, but I definitely know she you know, boys and men were threw in, right, as in addition to this conversation when we know that many boys and men experience sexual assaults. I think what's alarming about that is many don't recognize that it's a sexual assault that's taking place, right? I know from the men's group that I've run, I've had several brothers who are very open and honest about being in quote unquote relationships with older women, both voluntarily and involuntarily, right? And not even recognizing that uh, that individual was a predator. And so I think it's important because we also see the impact of that in the ways that both the good doc and doll baby brought up, right? We see that manifest itself later in life and men. So I just want to bring that up.
I think that's, oh, I'm sorry, I keep cutting you off. Now, I just think,
Natalie.
I think that that's such a good point, Phil, because actually most of my career with with survivors and in my work with sexual assault was with males, right, with boys and men. And I think that goes back to something you guys touched on earlier about normalizing trauma. We normalize the sexual victimization of men because we encourage them to be, you know, they have to be virile, they have to be sexually active, they have to go out and get girls, even if that's not what they're into or what they're interested in that point in time. And there's so many men that I found when I was doing therapy who did not know that they had been sexually victimized. Like they just didn't know. And because we normalized that type of contact, it was normal for, you know, you to be 13 or, you know, even some as young as 8, 9, 10 and having sex with 16, 18-year-old babysitters. Like, so this goes back to things that within the Black community, we don't spend enough time. We talk to our girls about their virginity and being pure and don't be fast and don't give it away. But we need to protect our boys in the same way. So I think, Phil, I appreciate you bringing that up because I always like to advocate for men and boys as well.
No doubt. I'm sorry, you keep trying to go on, and I just keep interrupting.
No, go
just,
ahead.
and this is just for people to reflect on, right? When we think about normalizing, then we also talk about, you know, the impact of, I don't like to say toxic masculinity, I like to say unhealthy people, right, or unhealthy persons. But the majority of us have heard about Larry Nassar in Michigan State and what happened with the Olympic girls. Is everybody familiar with that, right? But at Ohio State, 177 boys/men were sexually assaulted, right, for over a span of 30 years. And we haven't heard a peep about that. And a part of that is this idea of masculinity and also just how we view sexual assaults and sexual violence. All right, I'm good.
Thank you for that. I really do appreciate it. So since you're unmuted, just wanted to know, I think this is a good segue to all the points that you've made is talking about this type of trauma and what does it show up like in relationships?
Oh man, what you trying to take me down relationship lane? Oh, you gonna have me in tears, right? No, I think Natalie brought it up. This idea, this inability to connect. We're talking about violence, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. Did I say inability to connect? Promiscuity. Again, it's a litany of ways that it impacts us. I'm reminded of the conversation between Nikki Giovanni and James Baldwin. And feel free to go watch it on my YouTube at Phillip MSW, where I did a showing of it because I wanted to have a conversation on it. And it was such an important moment where Nikki was trying to explain to James, she and it might have went viral. She said, "Why can't you fake it with me?" Right? And then we're talking about heteronormative type of relationship right now, even though we know that it impacts all. And he said, "Well, I can't fake it with you, right? Because I'm so busy faking it all day, right? I'm so busy having a smile in the white man face at the job. I have to do this out in the community that when I get home, I can't fake it with you." Right, but I'm all faked out. And she's saying, well, if you care about me and you love me, you would show me that healthy, positive side of you, even if it is a lie, because I deserve that. I'm here. I'm taking the brunt of what's taking place. And I think it spoke to just the nuances because they both were right? They both were valid. And I think when we talk about our intimate relationships, how many of us don't recognize the mask that we wear throughout the day, all the pain and trauma that we're bringing with us, some that we recognize, some that we don't recognize, and how that's showing up in these intimate relationships.
Thank you for that. Dr. Mack, would you like to respond?
So, it can show up as an inability to trust and therefore constantly monitoring the status of the relationship, and monitoring in many different ways. So it could be monitoring as in actual monitoring, trying to look at someone's phone, following them where they go, things like that, or monitoring as in, do you love me? Am I attractive? Are you sure? Are we good? Are we still together? Are we solid? That kind of monitoring can be going on. Attempts to control your partner, which could very easily result in domestic violence. Being overly scared of rejection, overly worried about rejection and abandonment, and therefore not being willing to put yourself out there for intimacy in a healthy way, and wanting to reject others, assuming that you're going to be rejected anyway. So trauma can do all of that stuff to relationships. There's a lot like, there's an album I love, Jasmine Sullivan. So I love her new album actually. And the whole album is really about relationship trauma. That's what it is about. It is about different women talking about trauma that they've had in different aspects of different relationships. And so I think that if it's entertaining and she can sing, but if you kind of listen to it with that ear, it might have a different effect. And it can very, very easily be used as a tool toward healing some of that.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. And so for the next question, Dr. Mack and Phil, this one is for you. How is the LGBTQ plus community continuously traumatized by what can be the lack of support they receive from the Black community overall?
So How are they continuously traumatized? So having family support is one of the strongest predictors of outness for Black LGBTQ folks. And for Black people, families are extended and even include like our churches, which have been notoriously unwelcoming to LGBTQ folks. And then Black gay men are disproportionately experiencing negativity as compared to their white counterparts. So for a gay white man, they might still be looking at a gay Black man as inferior based on race, but they would get the same energy from their own community, from a straight Black man, because they only see that man as gay. Um, and so this all, it stems from slavery. When Black men were enslaved, and often they would be subjected to, it's called buck breaking, actually, meaning that they were raped by their owners as a tool to make them feel inferior. That's been imprinted. And centuries later, that mentality is still in the background of our culture. It's there. And it results in greater rates of depression and social isolation and suicide and things of that nature.
Thank you for that. Phil, were you going to respond?
Yeah. There we go. I definitely think she hit on some good points. When I sit in and think about it, right, we're talking about the denial of somebody's identity, the denial of an experience that is very real. See what happens when we're talking about trauma. And since we're talking about Black folk, we're talking about Black folk, right? So many beautiful things that come with us, but we still got a ways to go in certain areas, and so we do this we're running this trauma Olympics, right? Where you got Black men at the top, right? They get the gold. Then you got Black women, and then you got our trans men, trans women, trans persons, queer folk, non-binary, who are all trying to vibe for this vibe for how can I put this? Not necessarily attention, but love, vie for love from those at the top, right? And so we see a minimizing of those experiences. I run a men's group, and I consider myself, extremely progressive, right? It's this again, we talking about human beings. Love who you love. I'm here for it. I'll be there clapping for you, because love is a hard thing to find, and loving self is even harder, right? In this men's group, I wanted to show a video and have a talk back on. It was a Breakfast Club interview with Malik Yoba and a couple trans sisters that was on there. And so I didn't want to tell the brothers what was taking place because I didn't know how they was going to respond to it. And so it was interesting because they sat and watched about 20 of them, and we had discussion over it afterwards, right? And what was coming up was this idea of identity and using pronouns and what have people just weren't comfortable with that, right? And so when it comes to men, a lot of times you have to use concrete examples of their own experience that they can relate to and resonate with in order for them to understand, we're saying them, us to understand another's perspective. Again, ideally it shouldn't come to that. You should be able to say, listen, this is the situation. You say, okay. And with that, I saw brothers who were initially pushing back against the ideas of using pronouns and viewing them as women, and recognizing that these are social constructs that are created to separate. And it have these brothers coming around, and we know that Black men are the number one killer of Black trans folk, right? And so if I can have these brothers be willing to have this conversation, that bodes well for embracing a community and embracing the identity and the humanity of another, because that's all what we're talking about, right? We're talking about the humanity of another, and when we deny that, that's when we see that trans persons, and LGBTQ plus folk having the highest rate of homelessness, right? We see the addiction come in, right? Because again, as the good doc said, where families pushing them out, friends are pushing them out, society is pushing them out, and so they, what's left, right? Their quality of life is diminished due to no fault of their own.
Thank you for that. Thank you for explaining that. And so one of the things that I wanted to ask you all before we do transition into questions from the audience is there anything you would like to add to this conversation that I did not already ask? And this is a question to all of the panelists. And we would just ask that you keep your responses to 2 minutes. And for this question, we can start with Natalie.
So I think that it's important for us to also remember that in this series is about healing, right? So we spend a lot of time talking about the bad things that Black people have experienced and the trauma and the pain, but we are a resilient people. We are still here after being enslaved, after being oppressed. We have had someone ascend to the highest office in the land. We now have a vice president. We just got the right to vote like 50 years ago. So you think about Black people, we are resilient, but we just have to do a better job of taking care of ourselves and then taking care of each other, right? So taking care of ourselves, setting boundaries. We have to begin this process of unmasking and being authentic in our pain and what we're experiencing. I just think it's important for us to think about building a culture of wellness instead of a culture of trauma and pain, right? So let's stop thinking about, listen, slavery is not, it's always going to be in the back of what we have experienced. But I think we also have to begin to build a culture of triumph and acknowledging the kings and queens that we are. I think it's moving, it's getting some momentum, but I'm just very focused on this idea of wellness. And I think we have to define wellness for ourselves. That's the other part, right? So our wellness is not going to look like what white people want it to look like. It's going to look like what works best for us in our culture and how we do things. And so we have to take charge of this. We can't look to anyone else, any other community to save us. We got to do it for ourselves, and we got to do it for each other. So that would be my thing, is just to begin to think about what wellness looks like for us. Wellness for Black people might not be doing yoga 3 times a week, or maybe it will be. For some people that works, some people it doesn't. Maybe for us it's going, to somewhere and banging on a tambourine. There's lots of different ways. So I just want us to begin to think about that and imbue that, and think about getting into some of that hippy dippy stuff with eating and the way we take care of our bodies, because that's a whole nother part of trauma we didn't talk about, but that mind-body connection. But I think I took my 2 minutes, so I'm going to pass the mic now.
Thanks, Natalie. Dr. Mack, how about you?
So I was thinking along the lines of what Natalie's thinking, but I was thinking about what I would want someone to take away from this that's having a trauma response to something in the moment. So what do I do if I'm like here in a meeting and I'm having a trauma response to something? What can I do? So the first thing I would want them to do is to experience it as it is, to say what it is, to name it. I'm having this response. Here are the things that I'm feeling, like to be able to go over that in your head pretty quickly. To get moving. So to stand up, excuse themselves, go to the bathroom, take a walk, do something like that. Not isolate. So call someone who understands and knows your pain and that you may be going through something and that you have prepped that you may need to do this at some point, or a therapist or a counselor or something like that. And this is really one of the most important things, is learning to change and control your arousal system. So learning how to breathe, to calm yourself, like deep breathing and being present in the moment and understanding where you are, because sometimes a trauma response will take you away from where you actually are. And you will forget the space that you're in. And breathing and presence is really, really helpful to get you back into that space. So those are the kind of takeaways that I would want people to have.
Thank you. And Phil will have you with the last comment for this session.
There we go.
Can I just go on the record to say Phil is worse than me with the unmuting, in case you all didn't notice.
And I teach weekly, right? Like you think I'd be used to it. No, I think it's like a ditto and trito. You know what I mean? Like I agree with all of what they said. For me, I don't necessarily know what healing is in this grand scheme of everything that we've experienced as a community, right? We say it's individualized and it's an individual process as well as a community process. This idea of healing, I just, just we're worth it, right? We're worth working through whatever internal issues and navigating those, you know, our wellness. We're worth it. That's really it.
Thank you for that. Thank you definitely for ending that portion of our time together. And so now we're going to take some questions from the audience. And so our first question, and I will send this one to Natalie, is what is the connection between trauma and anxiety?
So there's actually a physiological response in your body, right? So there's the part of your brain, the amygdala, which is activated in times. This is something that has developed over time through evolution. And that's responsible for the fight, flight, and freeze responses, right? So back when you think about cavemen, and there were threats to them in the community, and so they had to develop responses. Do I fight this thing? Can I beat it? Do I freeze because if I freeze, it can't see me or whatever, or do I run? And so that part of the brain becomes activated during trauma, during a traumatic experience, and then it can remain activated. And so you're constantly in a state of hyper arousal. Your cortisol levels are high, and this is the same thing. This ties in with anxiety now, because you're constantly aroused and you're constantly worrying, right? So anxiety is marked by like excessive worry. So you're when you don't feel safe and you're worrying about your surroundings, you then can develop anxiety disorders. And some of that is physiological, and then some of that is also your brain telling you, I'm not safe. I need, I'm worried. This person doesn't seem like they're good for me. This reminds me of something that happened to me in the past. And so that's how those two disorders, or the two, I guess the event, the trauma, and the and anxiety are connected.
Thank you for that. Any other insights that Phil or Dr. Mack want to add to the different? Okay, awesome. Thank you. So our next question is, and we'll go to Dr. Mack for this one. What are some ways of treating trauma, and how can someone recognize, or what are the signs of when someone maybe should start to seek treatment?
Tell me the first part of that question again.
Yes. What are some of the ways that people can start to actually treat their trauma? And then what are some of the ways when people may recognize, what are some ways that things are happening where people should actually seek treatment?
Oh, okay.
Some of the signs.
Mm-hmm. So I think that you probably should seek treatment when you realize you've gotten to a space that you can no longer cope on your own, or put your own coping mechanisms aren't working for you anymore. And so you used to be able to breathe your way through a situation and be fine, and it didn't happen for long periods of time after that. And now you find that when you start to try to breathe your way through it, you actually hyperventilate. the image won't go away. It's, you're not sleeping well, you're not eating well, you're anxious, you don't want to be around people, you only want to be around people. Like, so anytime there are extremes, you might want to speak to someone about it. Now, I'm always reluctant to tell people to go to therapy. I don't think that that's a thing for everyone. I think that it's a very powerful tool. I do think it is important that you speak to someone who has some experience about some of the things that you're experiencing. And there are lots of ways to deal with trauma. There is traditional therapy, there's counseling, there's mindfulness, there's group therapy. Um, there's some people do it through a form of yoga. Some people um, find a partner, like a support person to work with through it with. So it really varies. There are lots of ways to handle it. But the first thing you have to do is recognize that it is becoming out of your own control.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
And let me just say too, I'm sorry, that I think that one thing that is true about us and our community is that we don't seek help when we need to. There's a stigma around us taking care of our mental health. So we don't want to go to a therapist. We don't want to address our mental health. And if we do, we don't want anyone to know that that's what we're doing. It is a sign of weakness. It means that we can't handle our business. It means that we're not strong. We have this whole thing about being a strong Black whatever you are. And really the sign of strength is that you know when you seek community, when you seek help.
Thank you. Thank you definitely for expanding upon that. So this question is actually for Phil, and it's in the chat. It says, how can we get more Black men involved in the wellness realm? Oftentimes it's targeted towards women, and men have to always be strong, and wellness is put on the back burner.
See how fast I unmuted myself right there? Listen, I told you, I ain't playing. What was the question again?
See,
How
he got that. How can we get more Black men involved in the wellness realm? Oftentimes it's targeted towards women, and men have to always be strong and put wellness on the back burner.
I mean, I'd push back against that and say we are in the wellness realm, right? But it's just not necessary. We're not in all the realms. And so, one thing is I see nothing but Black men in the gym, right? I consider communing with other brothers, whether it's playing video games, that's considered, helping my wellness. Now, I think when we talk about this idea of vulnerability and transparency, and formal therapy, I definitely think there's room for improvement in those areas. Again, understanding what we're up against. We're talking about centuries of trauma, right? And we've navigated the best that we can. So an example, back when I was a behavior specialist, I worked in Norristown, working with four brothers who experienced trauma. They were from Philly, but moved out to Norristown, and you'll hear why. So the oldest was 15. It was about 15, 12, 10, and like 7. And so the reason they ended up living with their grandmother, who has her own psychological issues, is because they were literally pumping gas, giving the money to her mother and their mother and her boyfriend so they can get high, right? And so they were placed out there. And so here I am tasked with having to work with these boys, right, who've experienced life in ways that some of us could not imagine. I think chronologically we could say they're boys, but experience wise they're men, right, based off what they've experienced. And so I go out there, and the three younger ones, because of course they get a big Black man, all the boys, because we're rare in this space. And so the three youngest boys, they took to me automatically. Let's go do X, Y, and Z. Can we? I'm like, all right, cool. We're gonna do this. Treat you, use some of that clinical jargon. But the oldest, he just wasn't fudging with me, right? Because he's the oldest. He's experienced the most. And so I would come. He wouldn't even acknowledge me, right? Talk to his brothers, and keep it moving. And so that continued to happen for a period of months, right? And again, when we talk about this white supremacy medical model when it comes to psychology, right? You gotta, well, what are you doing, right? This is what your supervisors want to know. What's not working? And it's just like, yo, think about what they've experienced, right? And so it was after a few months, I get like, yo, what's up, man? How you feeling? And he was like, all right. And I was like, you want? He was like, well, I was like, you want to go somewhere, have a conversation? He was like, nah, but I mean, you could sit here while I play the game. So I sat there with him while he played the game. Again, this was after like 12 weeks of no communication. And so others look at, they were looking at it like, oh my gosh, he's just non-compliant. And I was just like, I don't know what you see, right? But I see growth. It went from him not wanting to have a conversation to him allowing me to be in his space, right? When we talk about trauma. And what I attribute that to is the consistency, right? Consistency when it comes to black boys and men is important because many of them are used to being let down in one way or another, whether it's through, family, interpersonal relationships, or by society, right? So that consistency is so important. Being open and honest, right? Having real conversations. So many of us can smell BS. Just as a community, we can smell BS, from a mile away. We know who's there for what reason. And continue to operate from a loving, reaffirming space. With the men's group that I have, I'm always, amazed that the brothers come out and they just so open, honest, and real. It's because I offer a safe space. I use the example, of a brother who says, yo, this B is getting on my nerves, right? If you say that in society, you're misogynistic, you're X, Y, and Z, when that's the only language that he has to express what's taking place in his life. And so when he gets to the group, yes, he can say that, but then not only are we going to push back against that and why you feel comfortable, but we're also going to try to peel back the layers to understand, what's taking place. Because what you're saying is you're feeling hurt, you're feeling pained, but not necessarily have the language. So we talk about having a safe space and being a safe space for men is important, and because it's not about you, it's about them, right? And sometimes in relationships and our interpersonal relationships, we center ourselves when we want somebody else to do some work.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. And thank you for that reframing at the beginning. Natalie, I have a question for you. In the chat, it says, how can traumatic responses lead to addiction?
I get all the hard science questions. But I just wanted to say something about Phil's response. I think Phil highlighted a really important part of things that you do when you first start trauma treatment. And that's learning to identify your feelings, right? So a lot of people have a very limited feeling vocabulary. So they're mad, sad, glad, I'm pissed off, right? But we know that anger is really just a secondary emotion. There's a lot of other feelings underneath. So just a simple tip for folks, if you're looking for things you can do to increase your own healing, start with learning your feeling words and being able to determine how those feelings, where you experience them in your body, what it looks like for you. And that's like something you will learn in the beginning of many therapies anyway. But back to the question that I was asked, I think trauma and addiction go hand in hand because addiction is a coping mechanism to avoid, right? So if we think about the hallmark of PTSD is avoidance of stimuli or situations that remind you of what happened. Why wouldn't you get high? Because that's going to keep you from experiencing the things that have you so worked up, that have you so scared. A lot of people, have experienced some level of trauma. And when I say addiction, that's just not drugs and alcohol. That's food, that's sex, that's spending money, that's risky behavior. There's all types of things that people do and develop addiction. That's gambling, right? They're using, this is a time where I can dissociate or I can run and avoid the stressors and the triggers of what I've experienced in the past. So it's almost like they go hand in hand. Addiction is like a way of, okay, I don't get psych meds and I'm not talking about this, so I don't have that benefit of gradual exposure to kind of lessen the symptoms. So I have these other things that I substitute. I like the way it feels when I go, I know Natasha talked about eating disorders. I like how I feel when I binge and purge. I like that control it gives me. I like when I go, smoke some weed. It helps me forget all of the stressors that I'm dealing with. So, experiences of trauma and addiction often go hand in hand.
Thank you for that, Natalie. Before we move on to our last question, did Phil or Dr. Mack want to respond to that? Okay, awesome. So previously we talked about how trauma can impact intimacy in relationships. And so Dr. Mack, can you talk a little bit more about that, a little bit more in depth about how intimacy can be impacted by previous trauma?
So when you say intimacy, that can be defined 10 million different ways. Are we speaking about intimacy, or are we talking, is this question about sex?
So I think that I don't want to assume the person's intent in the chat, but is there a way that you could potentially answer both of them?
Okay, so I'll just group them. I'll group them in together.
Okay.
Sex can be intimate, but not necessarily. But we'll group them in together. So how can trauma affect intimacy? So there's a such thing as trauma bonding. So it is possible that based on the fact that someone has experienced or is experiencing trauma and then like hooks up with someone else who is having some issues, that they will mesh and become a couple and try to establish a relationship and work through the dysfunction together in an intimate relationship, which normally will not work. It is not a healthy beginning, and it is very difficult to build health into that without outside help. So it could be a lot of things. It could start a cycle of violence if trauma hasn't been addressed. It can lead to the multiple rapid breakups and getting back together and that kind of thing that happens. We don't want to be together. We do want to be together. We're not good for each other, but we miss each other. And that codependence can happen, where you really just feel like you have to have the other person with you in order to be whole and healed and whoever it is that you want to be. So there are all kinds of ways that trauma can negatively impact an intimate relationship. It can definitely impact a sexual relationship depending on the source of the trauma. So if it was a sexual trauma, I mentioned all the ways earlier that it could impact a sexual relationship with regard to dysfunction and things of that nature.
Thank you. And before we switch to the healing component of our session, Natalie or Phil, did you want to add anything to that?
I just want to say, I think, Natasha, I think that type of love, that trauma bonding love, is sometimes glorified, right? That's that ride or die, that hood love that people love to talk about. And a lot of times there's a lot of like dysfunction in those relationships, and that's the bond. That's what's they love the excitement, the makeups, the breakups, the fights. It's exciting for us to get into a fight, and then the sex or the connection that we have afterward is what they're chasing, and that becomes an addictive cycle for many people. So I think that was a great point.
Yeah, it's the reward. It's the reward that keeps the bond there. It's the waiting for the thing. It's very much like chasing a drug.
Thank you for that. And so now we are going to transition into our healing component, and we will have Adriana here, who is going to talk us through stress in the body and guide us through some breathing and meditation before we close out this evening.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Adriana Adele. Pronouns are she, her, and I'm a yoga teacher in Philadelphia. I also teach meditation, breath work. I've been practicing for about 10 years and teaching for about 5. I'm so grateful to be here with you, particularly for this event. The name Divine Healing resonates so deeply with me. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the author and activist Sonia Renee Taylor. She wrote the book, Your Body is Not an Apology, but she recently said, I arrived here as inherently divine and enough, and my job is to clear the way between anything standing between me and my divinity. I just wanted to share that because that feels very on point with the conversation that I'm so grateful to have been able to come through and listen to the tail end of. I think that the breath can be a really powerful tool and resource, as it's, I think of it as the first thing that we receive and the last thing that we release. And the practices that we'll be doing tonight will come from, as I'm a yoga teacher, come from the yoga tradition. And I always feel very called to just say that the practices of yoga have roots in India and also in Egypt. So I always like to say, especially when I'm in a room of divine Black folk, that they are practices for us, by us. So we'll take some time to get into them. I often consider the breath as that connection to that something greater. In the practice of yoga, sometimes it's called prana, or like the vital life force, that animating quality to all things. And you may have a different way that you relate with it or different words that you use, but sometimes we're all just sort of talking about the same thing. What I was able to hear earlier when I hopped onto the call were a few points, I mean, so many great points, even in like the 20 minutes that I was on listening. And we'll touch on a couple of the topics and a couple of the points that I heard come up during our conversation. One of the reasons why I think the breath is such a vital resource, or can be a vital resource, is because of the way our nervous systems work, the way that we're wired. I heard Natalie talk about it some when she was talking about trauma and anxiety, our amygdala, our fight and flight response, flight, fight, and freeze response. And that's really where I like to start when I talk to folks about the breath. I guess a little more about me, along with my 10 years of practice, my 5 years of teaching. My undergrad was also in neuroscience. So I kind of like to bring all of it together when I'm having conversations with folks. Our nervous system is broken into a couple different parts, one of which is our autonomic nervous system. And I like to think of it as our automatic nervous system. So it's those involuntary parts of ourselves, our involuntary movements, and the regulatory stuff that goes on within us. And so we can think of things like our blood pressure. We can think of things like our heart rate, digestion, and our breathing rate. As Natalie touched on when she was speaking earlier, we have our fight and flight response and we have our freeze response. So if we think of them as two different sides of the spectrum, fight or flight is that hyper arousal, right? Like looking around, seeing what's going around, trying to keep ourselves safe. And freeze is that hypo arousal state where you're just sort of stuck. There's no movement. You sort of just curl inward and freeze. As Natalie said before, you know, if you were running from a bear or whatever it is, whatever stressor was in back in the day, I like to think a tiger, a lion, a bear, you're either going to fight, you're going to flee, or you're going to freeze. The fight or flight response is more correlated to our sympathetic nervous system, and our parasympathetic nervous system is that freeze response. And also within the parasympathetic nervous system, we do have this place where people call like tend and befriend, the place where we still feel safe, we still feel social. And the parasympathetic nervous system is also a part of ourselves that is wired for resting, for digesting, and I like to think for healing as well. So our breath is one way in to that autonomic nervous system. So we can't really control our digestion. We can't always control our heart rate, but we can have a little bit of engagement with our breath, right? When we start to get stressed out, I'm not going to actually do it, but what happens? We tend to hyperventilate. Yeah. So that's how our breath can be sort of, we can tap into it as a sort of like almost backdoor regulatory way to what's going on underneath our surface. That's a little oversimplified. And if there are any questions at the end, of course, please feel free to let me know. And I also want to point out that what Dr. Mack said about sometimes you focus on your breath and then you do start to hyperventilate. So I just want to make it very clear that the breath might not be everyone's way in. I heard a little bit of the conversation earlier around the breath being, around healing being individualized. And I also loved that Phil brought in that collective, because that's always so important. We all have to find our own ways into the breath, or our own ways into our healing. And sometimes it's a journey, and sometimes it's non-linear, right? Sometimes it's trying things on and taking them off in that kind of way. So with that, I do like to say there are no obligations in anything that I'm going to offer tonight. And I like to just explain what we're going to do. So the practices we'll be doing will be coming from yoga. Some of it will be coming from somatics, which is another like healing therapeutic modality. And that'll be the most of it. We'll start off with a little bit of sensory work, just to place ourselves in the moment. I know that you've probably been at your computer since 6:30 since this started, but sometimes even when we're in the same place for a while, it's good to just give ourselves that moment to arrive. Yeah. From there, we'll do just like a little bit of movement, because again, you've been here since 6:30, so we'll just move our bodies around, see how that feels. We'll take a moment, give ourselves a little body scan just to notice what we're feeling, not judging it, just noticing. And then we'll move to a little bit of breath awareness. And like I said before, if turning into the breath, noticing the breath doesn't feel right for you in this moment, if it does feel like it's bringing in any hyperventilation or stress, because we don't want the breath to be another place where we stress out, right? So if that happens, you're welcome to come back to the sensory and for the sensory work we did, or you're welcome to come to some movement work that we are going to do. From there, we're just going to notice how we're breathing. One of the patterns that's often found in the breath that is maybe not the most healing or not the most beneficial is when we inhale, we pull in our belly, and when we exhale, we push out our belly. And the breathing pattern, if anyone's ever gotten the chance to see a baby breathe, before they're sort of encumbered by, the toxic dominant culture and all of the patterns that we find ourselves in, you'll notice when they breathe and they inhale, the belly expands. And when they exhale, the belly comes in. So we'll play with that. We'll notice what we're doing without judging, just noticing. Because as someone said before, a lot of this work, a lot of this healing work starts with awareness. From there, we'll move into another breath work pattern. It's one of my personal favorites. I'm pretty sure it got me through 2020. It's a very simple breath pattern of humming on an exhale. What that does, I like to explain what I do before I do it, but what that does is it just helps us breathe in and out through the nose, which is a regulatory offering to our nervous systems and to ourselves. From there, if it feels safe and available, we'll move into adding a little count to the breath, because often making our exhales longer than our inhales is just that little, it's a way to let ourselves know that we're okay. Let ourselves know that we can calm down, slow down, breathe, and just get present. And then we'll just take some time to be. We'll just notice what we notice, not judge, and just give ourselves a moment to breathe. We live in a toxic dominant culture that glorifies the hustle, that glorifies the grind, that glorifies doing more and more and more until we find our place at that burnout, right? And we live in a toxic dominant culture that glorifies this grind so that we're distracted from our healing, that we're distracted from what we need to take to clear the way between us and our divinity. So if there are no questions, we'll just go ahead and get started. So take a moment and just notice how you're sitting. You may have been sitting for a while. Just take a moment and just notice if you've sort of gotten the Zoom slump going, or if you want to sit up tall. If it's possible to have your feet on the ground, I always find that very beneficial. It's literally grounding. It's reminding ourselves that we're connected to the earth, that connection to something greater, that place where we're all interdependent, interconnected. And then take a moment and start to look around your space. And start to notice 5 things that you can see. Maybe you notice 5 colors, maybe you notice 5 shapes. And maybe you say them in your head or out loud what you're noticing. When you're done with that, start to notice 4 things that you can feel. So maybe it's the feeling of your clothes on your body. Maybe it's the feeling of your feet on the ground. Maybe it's the temperature of the air against your skin or something else. And start to notice 3 things that you can hear. Maybe you hear my voice. Maybe there's a sound inside of your space. Someone in another room, the low hum of a refrigerator, which is what I'm hearing right now. And start to notice 2 things that you can smell. And then start to notice 1 thing that you can taste. Maybe it's a beverage you just took a sip of, or you brushed your teeth earlier, you still taste that. Notice what you can taste. So we start by moving through the senses to place ourselves in the here and now. I always like to say the breath is always in the present moment. And so often stress and trauma can try and pull us out of that present moment to the places and things we quite haven't done yet, the things that we're worrying about or the things that have already happened. So we're giving ourselves a moment to be in the here and now, the moment that we can truly engage with, the moment that we can truly shift if we choose to. From there, either with your eyes softly open or your eyes softly closed, just start to notice how it feels to be in your body. I'm going to take your awareness to the crown of your head and just let it move down the body, down the features of your face, down your neck, your shoulders, your chest, your back, your hips, your legs, your feet. And then just do that one more time. And just as you go from the crown of your head all the way down to the tips of your toes, notice if there's anywhere that's holding a little bit of tension. One of my dear friends and therapists often says the issues are in the tissues. So some of the stuff that happens to us on the day-to-day, that energy ends up within ourselves. So just notice, don't judge. Notice if you are holding any tension in the jaw, the shoulders, or somewhere else. And then with your hands, maybe on your lap or on your belly, just roll your shoulders out for a moment and just roll them back. Just roll them forward. And then start to reach both arms all the way up towards the sky, all the way overhead. And start to reach both arms down by your sides. Do that a couple more times, just bring in a little bit of movement. That inhale, maybe on the breath, reaching the arms up. Maybe an exhale, arms by your side. One more time, maybe on your inhale, you reach your arms up. And maybe on your exhale, you reach your arms down. And start to reach both arms all the way up. They don't have to go like super tight. They can be a little wider. Your palms can face in. Take your right hand to your right leg, take a breath in, and then just take a little side bend over to your right side. Just notice what you're feeling, where. No need to go super far or super fast. And start to bring yourself back through center, reach both arms up. And then left hand onto your left leg, take a breath in, and then a little bend over to the left. Come back through center, start to slide both hands right behind your head. Your elbows can come a little bit forward as if you could see them out of the corners of your eyes. And then just press your head back into your hands. Take an inhale through your nose. And as you exhale, let the tops of your shoulders just soften away from your ears. One more time, maybe take a breath in. And maybe on that exhale, you drop the shoulders away from the ears. Start to reach both arms all the way up. And then slowly start to give yourself a hug. Wrap one arm over the other arm. Give yourself a real hug, like a true embrace. Maybe you let your ear drop to one shoulder. You let your chin drop down into your arm. And then you have an option to start doing a little rocking left and right. So giving yourself that hug and letting yourself just rock a little left and right. Just that subtle sway. As you take a moment of self-possession, of holding yourself, and start to reach both arms up. And give yourself a hug the second way, other arm on top. Give yourself a little hug. You might even notice a little shoulder stretch back there. Maybe one ear to the shoulder or chin in between the arms, or maybe you take that little rocking side to side. And there's the invitation to call to mind one person or one being that you'd like to give this hug to. And let any positive feelings that come up when you think of this person, let them come to you. And start to give yourself a tighter hug, as if you could turn all of those positive energies and just turn them back to yourself for a moment, as if you could give yourself the same love, the same energy that you offer to those around you. And then let the swaying come down to stillness. And let your arms come wherever feels comfortable. You have the invitation to keep your eyes open or keep your eyes closed. If eyes are open, just look down towards the floor. And start to turn your gentle awareness that we sort of activated through the sensory work, through the movement work, and just turn that awareness towards the fact that you're breathing. Knowing that you don't have to change or manipulate your breath in any way. It's just an invitation to take a moment to notice what is. What does it feel like to be you breathing here now? As always, that reminder that all of this is just an offering, no obligation. If turning towards the breath doesn't feel safe and available, go back to some movement or the sensory work we did earlier. I invite you to just notice the length of your next inhale. And notice the length of your next exhale. And start to notice the temperature of the air as it moves in through the nose. And the temperature of the air as it moves out through the nose. Start to notice what moves on the inhalation as you receive the breath in. And what moves on the exhalation as you release the breath out. And maybe you notice that by simply shifting your awareness to your breath itself starts to shift. You can start to take one hand onto your chest, onto your heart area, and one hand onto your belly. And just come back to that movement of the breath. As you inhale, notice what happens to your belly. Does it draw in or does it expand out? And as you exhale, notice if it draws in or expands out. And if you'd like to join with a little engagement of the breath, really working with the breath, as you inhale, feel the belly press into your hand and feel your chest, your heart lift into your hand. And as you exhale, feel the chest fall, feel the belly draw back. That's all there is to do. Inhale, feel belly expand, heart lift. Exhale, feel chest fall, belly draw back. And notice what that feels like for you just a couple more times. Notice if you're forcing or pushing the belly or the breath, let it be a little more effortless, a little more easeful. And then we'll move to our first breath pattern. Just a humming breath. We're all on mute so no one can hear you. And all you have to do for this breath pattern is notice your next inhale. Exhale with your mouth and lips closed, make a low humming noise. At the end of the breath, just do it again. Take a breath in. Exhale a low humming noise. just keep going for 1 minute. Just receiving, just feeling the breath, not overstretching or over breathing. And then exhaling with the mouth and lips closed. This particular breath pattern is one that's said to draw us inward, and one that's said to offer some calm and soothing to the nervous system. You may focus your attention on the sound or the vibration. Just keep going for 1 more moment. And the next time you exhale, let the sound just dissolve into the air. And just come back to that natural breathing pattern. Take a moment to just notice any effects of the breath. And then we'll just add a little count to the breath. The next time you inhale, try and inhale for the count of 4. For 1, 2, 3, 4. As you exhale, count of 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Do it again. Inhale for 1, 2, 3, 4. Exhale for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Again, inhale 1, 2, 3, 4. Exhale for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Keep going for a minute. Going with your count, not my voice. Inhaling for maybe a count of 4. Exhaling for maybe a count of 6. I say maybe because maybe there's another number you prefer. 3 and 5. 3 and 6. Maybe you double the length of the exhale and try 4 and 8. Give yourself a moment to just breathe in this particular way for just a little bit longer. Sometimes I find a little relief, especially when it's a particularly hectic, busy, stressful day. I find relief in just taking a minute or two to breathe, knowing that all I have to do for that minute or two is breathe. And the next time you exhale, let the count go. And just come back to, again, that natural rhythm of your breath. You could take your hands and just place them down onto your lap. Maybe palms face up in your lap as a gesture of receptivity. Or if you'd like a gesture of grounding, palms face down on your lap. And either with your eyes closed or open, just be here for a moment. Knowing that this moment, here and now, of simply being and breathing is enough because you are enough. You are divine. And your healing, your breath are your birthright. We can close this out with just one big clearing, cleansing breath. Take a deeper inhale through your nose. And as you part the lips, exhale, audible sigh out through the mouth. With the lips closed, you can just gently seal in the session by bowing your chin down towards your chest, your head towards your heart. Once again, start to feel the places where your body is connected to support or the ground beneath you. Take a moment to feel the air around you. And when you're ready, slowly blink open your eyes, letting the light of the room and the energy of one another come back into your vision. Thank you very much for having me. I know I went 1 minute over. My apologies. If you happen to have any questions, feel free to let me know. Otherwise, again, thank you for this opportunity to be with y'all.
Thank you so much for being with us this evening. We do appreciate you so much. And thank you so much to our panelists, Ms. Natalie Dallard, Dr. Natasha Mack, Mr. Phillip Roundtree, and to our moderator, Ms. Lauren Footman. Also, we want to thank our president, Ms. Yolanda Hughes, for that awesome welcome. And please remember her advice to stay hydrated, take a deep breath, and do something to take care of yourself this evening. We appreciate you all so much for joining us. We ask that you take a look in the chat. There has been a survey drop, and we just ask that you please take the time to complete it so we can get your feedback about things that you liked about the program, as well as things that we can continue to do moving forward as a chapter. We hope that you enjoyed the program tonight and that it was filled with knowledge and tools that have awakened and uplift you. Thank you so much to the Divine Healing Committee for all of your hard work to make this happen this evening, as well as all the other members of the Chester Alumni Chapter. Again, please remember to fill out the survey. And we also ask that you will join us for our next function, which is February 24th, where we will be doing Foundations of Healing. And on this, we'll be looking at different self-care practices that you all can learn as you continue on with your own personal journeys of self-care and healing. So please take the time to complete the survey. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Other than that, good night, and thank you again for joining us.